As mentioned, I'm with Center for Food Safety, and I wanted to mention that our Executive Director, Andrew Kimbrell, will be giving this evening's keynote speech, so I hope that you all will stay and hear what he has to say. He'll integrate a lot of the themes that we are discussing today. We organized the Soil Plenary to underscore hope and possibility on the climate front. And what's really struck me, I've been an environmental activist for 20-something years, and you'll meet people that have worked on these issues, and the soil piece is new to them. And it's almost a professional embarrassment to have worked on something for so long and find that there's a huge piece of the puzzle that you were not aware of. And there are a lot of structural reasons for this. The climate movement, was really focused on emissions because a lot of the people that came up with the climate movement were engineering backgrounds, and a lot of the countries that are most responsible for the emissions are industrialized countries. So we're looking at, manufacturing, so forth. So that means it really is up to our movement to bring this hope and possibility to the climate movement that has been so mired in this message of gloom and doom. We have three outstanding speakers this morning, Kristin Ohlson, David Montgomery, and Rebecca Burgess. And I'm going to introduce Kristin first. Kristin is a freelance journalist and author, an essayist and fiction writer based in Portland, Oregon. Her articles have spanned subjects from zebrafish bioengineered to glow in the presence of pollutants to the biology of moral decision making. Kristin is the author most recently of The Soil Will Save Us. I call it a gateway book for the soil enthusiast. It was a finalist for the 2015 Oregon Book Awards. Please welcome our first speaker, Chris Ohlson.
Hi, thanks for having me here. This is great to be around all of you. So I grew up here at the edge of the Sacramento Valley, and my grandparents were farmers, and my father was involved in agriculture, and my parents were both like crazy gardeners and avid fruit and vegetable eaters, and I think that they knew where every single farm stand was in Northern California. But as much as they knew about, as much as my family knew about agriculture, I don't really think that they knew much about soil. And it's interesting, as I've always been in organic food and in agriculture, I didn't really know much about soil until a few years ago when I interviewed this guy for Gourmet magazine. His name is Parker Bosley. He's a chef. And he was one of those pioneering chefs back in the 80s that started to bring local and organic food into his restaurant because he had grown up on a farm and he knew that the food that he served his customers was only as good as the land that it came from, only as healthy as the land that it came from. And I was always asking him, well, what should I write about next? And one time he said, you should be writing about carbon farming, which is also called regenerative agriculture. It's that beyond organics thing that the other speakers were talking about. Sometimes people just call it the soil health movement. But he was saying this was the most important trend in agriculture. So this is farming that actually builds the health of the soil and builds the amount of carbon in the soil and increases the biodiversity instead of depleting both of them, which is what conventional agriculture does. So I started looking into it, and writing this book turned into this journey. And I developed this incredible sense of wonder about the amazing stuff going on under our feet, which we're completely unaware of. I read recently that scientists think that there are 300 sextillion stars in the sky, so that's 3 followed by 23 zeros. But in the soil, there's an even greater density of microorganisms, billions of microorganisms in a teaspoon of soil. So I'm guessing that there are more microorganisms under Richmond than there are stars in the sky. And they've been found down 10 miles down, but they're most active around the root zones of plants, which can go down quite far, farther than that. And we can't see these microorganisms, but everything that we want and depend on and hope for in our world above ground depends on what they're doing. And most of us don't know this. We think of Earth, planet Earth, as air and water and land. And we think of the land part as this very, very thin crust over a big dead rock that's hurtling through space. And even though I've been a gardener all my life and my, family was into agriculture, I had no idea how alive the soil is. So when I would hear the phrase life in the soil, which you hear a lot, life in the soil. So I would hear life in the soil and I would think earthworms, beetles, ants. And it took me, working on this book to understand that those are the leviathans of the soil. Those are like the great blue whales and the giant squids. It's the tiniest things that we can't see in the soil that really make it alive. It's these guys. All of these guys. And the only way we can live on this earth without destroying it is to learn how to work in harmony with these guys. So healthy soil has a vigorous population of microorganisms, of bacteria and fungi and protozoa and microarthropods and nematodes and other tiny creatures. And scientists have known that they were there for a pretty long time, but they haven't really known until fairly recently what they were doing there, what role they played, whether they were important, whether they were a problem. And what keeps coming out of the research now is evidence of this really incredible partnership between plants and soil microorganisms. So this partnership created the world that modern humans evolved into about 276,000 years ago, and it set the stage for us and all the other mammals. So what are the terms of this partnership? Most of us already know about photosynthesis. It's the great biological marvel of our planet, begun by bacteria about 2.4 billion years ago, and it changed our atmosphere into an oxygen-rich atmosphere that we can breathe. Photosynthesis is now carried on by both plants and bacteria, and both create oxygen. But when plants conduct photosynthesis, they do another really important job. They use energy from sunlight to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they toss off the oxygen. They don't need that. That's their waste product. And they convert the carbon dioxide into a carbon fuel, which they use to grow their stems and their trunks and their leaves and their flowers that came from the atmosphere. So when we eat plants, we're feasting on that carbon that used to be in the atmosphere. And when we eat animals, we're also feasting on carbon that used to come from the atmosphere because those animals have eaten plants. But plants don't use all of that carbon fuel that they've created just for their own growth. They shuttle about half of it down to their roots. And they stream it out through their roots, and they feed the soil microorganisms that are living around the roots, moving around the roots. So they're streaming out this carbon fuel to the soil microorganisms, and in exchange, the soil microorganisms are bringing plants the minerals that the microorganisms have mined from rock particles in the soil. So it's this trade. This trade that's been going on for millions and millions of years, and that's the deal. So there are over 90 naturally occurring minerals, elements in our planet, and it's possible that plants need all of those to grow, not just the handful of nutrients that we give them in chemical fertilizers. And the way they've always gotten the way they've always gotten those nutrients is through that partnership with soil microorganisms. So when you walk in the woods, or when you walk in a meadow, and do you ever look around and think, whoa, why are all these things growing so well? Did somebody fertilize it? No, it's because those plants are in this very active, very vigorous partnership with soil microorganisms. It's the microbes. So that's how plants partnership with soil microorganisms fertilizes plants, but it's also the main way that carbon builds up in the soil and cycles from the skies into the earth. So the microorganisms eat that carbon fuel that they've taken from the plants, and then they excrete it, and other microorganisms eat them and eat their excretions, and this carbon keeps getting broken down and stuck away in the soil, chunked away in the soil in different places. It gets concentrated there, it stays there. Some of it stays there, not all of it, but some of it stays there. And another way that carbon gets concentrated in the soil is by the engineering action of these soil microorganisms. So soil microorganisms make a kind of carbon-based glue to build tiny structures in the soil, to protect themselves and to control the flow of water and gases in the soil. And they engineer the soil, and they wind up creating what I like to think of as like billions and billions of cups and saucers stacked up in the soil. Or another way to look at it is they're creating what's very much like a coral reef in the soil. So healthy soil is like that coral reef. It's full of pores, full of little pockets where air and water can rest. Good soil is full of that kind of structure, and it's all held together by carbon. Most of us don't realize that it's carbon that makes soil healthy. We've gotten this idea that carbon is bad because we know that there's too much of it in our atmosphere. But it's not bad, it's just the balance of it is off. So good soil is also knitted together by microscopic mats of fungi, which pierce the roots of plants and share water and nutrients and chemical defenses and chemical messages within a plant community. So the hyphae of the fungi can run for 250 feet or more. So it makes sense that healthy soil is full of all those cups and saucers and all those fungi channels, is very porous. And because of that structure, they can receive and hold water in a way that unhealthy soil can't. So that's really important these days because we're all worried about water. We're all worried about rainfall. We're either worried about too much or not enough. And healthy soil handles both of those concerns. So this is a whoa. That's a slide from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, which builds up through that partnership between plants and microorganisms, an acre of soil can hold an extra 25,000 gallons of water. So if the rains don't come, the soil is still holding water from the last time it rained, and if 8 inches of rain fall in a few hours, the soil can absorb it and hold it, and it doesn't run off into the streams. But the problem is that almost everything that we've done as humans with agriculture has disrupted that ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganism. So remember, that's how nature grows stuff. The soil's always covered with vegetation, either live or dead vegetation. There's usually a live root in the ground, and there's lots of biodiversity. And this is how modern agriculture grows stuff. But it's not just a problem with modern chemical agriculture, although that's the best way, that's the most advanced way that we've come up with for ruining soil. As soon as we domesticated wild herds and changed the way they move over the land, as soon as we started to clear forests and burn them down and plow the earth to plant our seeds, as soon as we started to eliminate the great diversity of plants from the landscape to make way for the one crop that we wanted to plant, that's called a monoculture, as soon as we started keeping the land bare around that one crop, as soon as we interrupted the feeding relationship between plants and soil microorganisms with chemical fertilizers, we began disrupting that ancient partnership. So we started doing all this stuff 12,000 years ago with the beginning of agriculture, and with that we started releasing carbon that had been built up in the soil and sending it off to the sky. So some scientists estimate that 80 billion tons of carbon have been lost from the world's soils. And all that carbon from the soils, from other sources, from fossil fuels, all the carbon that's in our atmosphere is called the legacy load. And the climate change conversation that goes on in this country and around the world erroneously focuses on the 2 parts per million of carbon dioxide that human activity keeps adding to the atmosphere every year. We talk on and on about reducing that, but we don't pay enough attention to the 400 parts per million that are already there. The legacy load. So what we need to do is pull down. We need to pull down the carbon from that legacy load. And the best way to do that, the cheapest and most widely available technology, the technology that's been working for a very long time without glitches or unintended consequences, is the technology that nature invented, which is photosynthesis and plants' relationship with soil microorganisms. Our biggest impact on the environment may be agriculture in our 4 billion acres of croplands around the world, in our 14 billion acres of pasture and rangelands. Because of the kind of agriculture, because of conventional agriculture, the soil in most of our agricultural land is sick. It's biologically sick. By some estimates, a quarter of the world's land is sick from our human activity. But we can look at that. That's a really shocking number, a quarter of the world's lands being sick. We can look at that as an opportunity because we know that with really very simple agricultural practices that respect that partnership between plants and soil microorganisms, we can reverse that. We can start to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the land. So I think I've gone on too long. I was going to show you some of the farmers that I interviewed in my book. Conventional farmers, people who started off in conventional agriculture, found out they were failing, realized that they had to move away from tillage and chemicals and MGOs to really build resilient land to be successful as farmers. So I think there are more and more of these at work, and it's a very hopeful time because that message is spreading. And I think that what we can take from their work that really heartens me, I think it is a hopeful time, that we don't have to accept the false dichotomy that we can have good food or enough food, good agriculture or productive agriculture, healthy landscapes or sick landscapes. All these farmers around the world are showing that we can have good food, good agriculture, enough food, and that we can pull that excess carbon out of our skies and put it into our soils and really begin to address the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. Our next speaker, David R. Montgomery, is a professor of geomorphology at the University of Washington. So we've got kind of a Northwest theme going here. Montgomery received his BS in geology from Stanford University and his PhD in geomorphology from UC Berkeley. If you don't know what geomorphology is, it's the study of the Earth's forms that seeks to understand why landscapes look the way they do. He's the author of Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, which is a fascinating look at this problem throughout history, starting way back with the ancient Greeks, or the Mesopotamians actually, before the ancient Greeks. And he's also the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. His most recent book, The Hidden Half of Nature, written together with his partner Anne Beckley in 2015, lays out the astonishing reality that we've been missing in the soil beneath our feet and right inside our bodies. Please welcome David Montgomery.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come back down to where I'm actually from. I grew up in the Bay Area, and it's a real pleasure to come back and visit. The books I've written on soil, including the one with my wife, are up there on the screen. If you want to get them, we have them here. But what I really want to do is to try and cast a bit of the big picture in this talk about why a geologist would be so concerned about soil. And so I would like to ask, initially, what's the difference between Earth and Mars? And I'm not talking about oxygen and water. We know about those. The really big difference is that there's no soil on Mars. We have soil on Earth. Soil is the mix of geology and biology where those two things meet. It's the marriage of geology and biology. the living world of organisms that we can see, and importantly, as Chris was talking about, those that we cannot see, both beneath our feet and the microorganisms. And the way they interact is what really brings fertility to soil, brings soil alive, and allows life to flourish on this planet outside of the seas where it originated. So the big difference between Earth and Mars, soil. We tend to forget that all too often. And how have we forgotten that? Well, maybe it's taken us a long time to learn it, but if you look back at what we've done to the Earth's soil so far, something like a third, I think is closer to it, of the world's soil has been degraded by farming activities over the full sweep of history since the development of agriculture. Now think about the problem of feeding the world of 2050 or 2100 when we anticipate there being half again as many people on the planet as there are today. If we had that 1/3 of the world's original arable land in the state that its native fertility was in, we would have no problem feeding the world that's projected for the future, because we could easily produce half again as much food as we do now, even without changes in practices, with the one caveat that conventional practices, as we've heard today, have been degrading soil fertility over time. So if we keep going along the route we've been going in, we're just digging the hole deeper. We've also lost an astonishing amount of carbon out of the world's agricultural soils. And as you've also heard, there's a challenge about how to put it back in. But therein lies the good news, both at the end of this talk and at the end of the last talk and some of the other talks that you've heard. We can actually do that job. And the question isn't so much as how, as much as will we. And if you look at the history of how societies have degraded soil throughout the world, there's a long history of soil degradation that has contributed to the demise and decline of ancient civilizations. That's the central thesis of my dirt book. And I go through the stories of each of those civilizations in turn and try and draw lessons for modern society. And I have to confess, I struggled mightily in how to actually write the last chapter of that book. What you get when you read it is actually the third attempt to not write a really depressing view of the future. Over the last 10 years, as I've gone around and talked to farmers around the world, I've become much more optimistic, because I think we actually can solve the problems. People are solving the problems that I identified in that book, and there's creative ways to do it profitably, which is very, very exciting as well. What has been the fundamental problem with agriculture historically? Well, we heard a bit about no-till earlier, and that essentially puts the finger right on the problem, the plow. That most fundamental of agricultural icons has something that has done things to soils around the world over the course of history that you need to really pull together archaeology, modern science, contemporary accounts to try and triangulate, as I did in dirt, what happened as farming practices that degraded the soil and its fertility, its carbon content, no doubt, but also simply its physical presence on the landscape, eroding it away. Contributed to undermining the stability of society after society around the world. If you want a quick look at what that's done, there's actually our own country, the United States, for those of us who live here, is a very good example, and there's stories about, there's connections between the way people treated their land and the history of this country that I was never taught in high school or college or graduate school. But if you look into it and research it and read the 17th and 18th and 19th century sources, you can put it together as I did. But you can also go and look at modern science. The image on the screen up behind me now is a map of the Southeast. See if do I have a point? Yes, the Southeast, Virginia up here, down to Alabama down there. It shows the magnitude of soil loss in the Piedmont region, the hill country, the upland country, that was one of the original agricultural powerhouses of this country. But if you go to it today, you find that the topsoil is gone. They're farming the subsoil, the B horizon for the soil scientists in the audience. And this map basically shows you how many inches of soil have been eroded off that landscape since colonial agriculture started tobacco cultivation, which is very, very erosive. And you'll notice that a lot of this, between 4 and 10 inches of erosion, some of them above 12 inches. How thick was that rich layer of black topsoil that drove early agriculture? It was about a foot thick. So if we eroded off the entire topsoil of one of our original agricultural breadbaskets in this country over the course of just a couple centuries, imagine what the Romans could do with a couple millennia at it, or the ancient Greeks, or the Mayans, or the people living in Angkor Wat, or the ancient Chinese. You go around the world, the story is often very similar. Societies that didn't take care of their soil didn't last. And there's a wonderful quote from George Washington that I'll let you read because I'd have to turn around and read it because I can't remember things that are that long these days anymore. But it's a wonderful quote from him about how he projected that the fate of the United States lay in moving west of the Appalachians because of the terrible agricultural practices that colonists and early farmers in the United States were practicing on the eastern seaboard. We were degrading our land fast enough that he predicted that our future would have to be going over the mountains to get access to the fresh, fertile soils that had never seen a plow. This was 100 years before historians sort of looked back and talked about manifest destiny and all those other strange 19th century concepts. He was forecasting this simply looking at how people were treating the land. He paid attention. He was also not alone. Jefferson, Franklin, other people we like to cite from this era had similar kinds of insights. What happened? Well, you saw the map of colonial soil erosion that continued after his time. It may be a little dark, light in here to see that terribly well up on the screen now, but if you go to North Carolina today, you can basically go to a tobacco field, like over here on the right, that's the soil that you get. You go dig a pit in the forest next door where there hasn't been farming for 100 years, the soil's totally different. Same soil type, same parent material, completely different management. It only takes a century or less to destroy the soil. How long does it take to actually get it back? It takes nature a long time to rebuild soils. The slide up behind me now is a picture from my home state of Washington now. It's in the Palouse, eastern Washington, and it illustrates for you why a geologist like myself would think that soil erosion was a really big problem. All those little channels, they can be wiped out with one pass of the plow, but they really add up year after year. And this, by the way, is a wheat field. You don't see any wheat, you don't see any plants in it. It's a conventionally plowed winter wheat field, and that problem that was discussed earlier of leaving the soil bare is a huge problem. This is why small channels add up to a lot of erosion over time. I want to draw your attention to this little black thing right here. From there down to there, this is a stadia rod, a survey rod that's kind of washed out of the negative, but that's a 1 foot increment on it. This shows you a field in the Palouse in eastern Washington where in 1911, when the sod was broken for agriculture, the guy plowed around his water cistern. He didn't want to destroy his own water supply. By 1961, 50 years later, there's a 5 foot cliff around his water supply. That's a foot a decade, or about an inch a year of soil erosion. I guarantee you there is nowhere on the planet that soil naturally forms at the pace of an inch a year. And how can I guarantee you that? Well, I've actually done the research. In compiling the stories that went into the dirt book, I did something that has become very difficult to convince students to do. I went, and apologies to all the students in the audience, but I went to the library, and I went there for 3 weeks, and I Xeroxed and vacuumed up yes, we did have Xerox machines in those days when I wrote this. I vacuumed up all the data that I could find about how fast soils were eroding on agricultural fields and how fast they formed in natural circumstances to try and compare the two. And basically, this gives you the executive summary of what I found. If you want to find the whole thing, you can get the data out of the National Academy, Proceedings of the National Academy. But the formatting's off a little bit here. But essentially, if you look at conventional agriculture around the world, I found about almost 450 studies. The average erosion rate off of conventionally tilled or plowed fields is on the order of 1 to 4 millimeters per year. If you look at what it is in terms of natural rates of soil production, you're looking at less than 1/100th of that. There's a huge difference. However, if you look at erosion rates under no-till and conservation agriculture, you can get it down to about the rate of soil production. In other words, the first step in conserving soil over the long run is not losing it altogether. The good news is that we can do that. The bad news is that the methods that it would take to do that are currently called alternative agriculture. We need to make those methods and practices conventional agriculture. That's how we solve the problem. But as I'll get to in the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have, that's only the first step. But if you're wondering whether or not this really matters over the long run, I invite you to do the back of the envelope kind of math that I have up here on the screen. If you take that difference, a conservative difference of about 1 millimeter a year between conventional erosion rates off of agricultural fields and rates of soil production, you get a net loss of at least 1 millimeter a year. It's very conservative with the numbers that I showed you. That means that you could erode off the 0.5 meter to 1 meter, a 1 to 3 foot thick soil that is typical of most hillsides around the planet in only 500 to 1,000 years. That's about the lifespan of most major agricultural civilizations with a few key exceptions. And those are the ones along major river floodplains around the world where the deposition of sediment eroded off of uplands, places like Ethiopia, Somalia, the Himalaya, Tibet, places that are not terribly well endowed with fertile soil anymore, subsidized agricultural civilizations downstream, and those few societies that practiced intensive agriculture that built soil. Those are the exceptions. So the question, of course, is can we reverse the historical decline of soils around the world? And I happen to know for a fact that we can because my wife did it in our yard. This shows the soil we started with in a lot in urban North Seattle. This is the soil that we have now. We can actually reverse that. If you want to see how we did it, talk about it, we'll be talking in the breakout session next door in the Burbank room, I think it is, in the next session. Please come hear about that and the stories that we tell and the relationship between the microbial world, that, as Chris was talking about, and the world of plants and human health. But how do we do this on farms around the world? I've just finished a book. I actually get the copy-edited version back on Monday that'll be out next spring called Growing a Revolution that Norton will publish next May, where I visited farmers all around the world who were practicing regenerative agricultural practices and trying to draw what are the common elements together, can it be done, how practical is it, and this shows you soil samples that Rattan Lau, in his long-term experiments at The Ohio State University. The stuff on the left that looks kind of like the soil that we started with in our yard is the stuff that has been grown conventionally with no-till for about 20 years. The stuff on the right is no-till with different practices, with cover crops and organic amendments. You'll notice the big difference in the color. Well, what I found is that with many of these farmers that I visited, whether it was in the Dakotas with Dwayne Beck here at Dakota Lakes Research Farm, where he's basically gotten into no-till with cover crops and bringing more diversity to the land. This is the landscape I used for the cover of my dirt book. It no longer blows. They've completely transformed the area. In a 300-mile circuit that we drove through this region, I saw 2, maybe 3 tilled fields. They've completely transformed it and done it profitably and increased the health of their soil. I visited Kofi Boa in Ghana to look at how smallholder farms in Africa can take some of the same principles that are behind what Dwayne is doing and apply it to food production in the developing world, and was amazed at what he had done. Gabe Brown, David Brandt are also 2 rock stars of the soil regeneration movement that I went and visited and talked to. And the commonalities between the practices that all these guys have been doing are really pretty simple and pretty amazing. And they boil down to those 3 principles that you heard about earlier. Don't disturb the soil, keep the ground covered with cover crops, and preferably with legumes that fix nitrogen, and grow a diversity of crops in a rotation. You know, those are pretty simple practices. And one of the big problems is that they're not products. How do you sell a change in thinking? How do you sell a change in practice? Well, what you have to do, I think, is show that it works and show that it works profitably, which all these folks and the others that I interviewed in the book have done. And then other farmers will start catching on. So I think we're at a place where we're starting to really see the next revolution in agriculture unfold, because we're getting to a point where it actually makes sense for a farmer's short-term interests to actually embrace practices that are in society's long-term interest. That was the problem I wrestled with in the dirt book. I think that we're on the verge of seeing solutions become more widely recognized and known, and essentially, I'll skip the carbon slide there. Basically, I was going to tell you that the ranges and estimates how much carbon we could put back into the ground vary a lot. The big point is that we should be doing these practices whether or not we put any more carbon in the ground. The carbon thing is a bonus, and it could be huge. It may not be all that some want it to be, but it could be very huge and impressive. Basically, it also helps solve other problems, and I'll finally invite you to the talk that will be going on in more detail about the hidden half of nature in a few minutes. If you want to, we've finally joined the social media world, feel free to join us, and I'll stop there because I think I've been out of time for about a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We now know how the soil, the carbon gets in the soil. We also have a global and historical perspective. And finally, our last speaker, Rebecca Burgess, the executive director of Fibershed, a nonprofit organization that provides, that generates awareness and provides economic development services to build and sustain a thriving bioregional textile culture is going to give us some on-the-ground examples of how we can do this. And I think the fiber piece is often overlooked. So if soil is overlooked, maybe sometimes people will make the connection between soil and food, but fiber is barely in people's consciousness. So please welcome Rebecca, who's also the author of Harvesting Color, a bioregional look into the natural dye traditions of North America. Rebecca Burgess.
All right, I know we're short on time, so I'm going to be brief and just share with you all. I feel like I'm coming off the front lines of regional economic development this week, finding out that as we're trying to regenerate this movement of building out these supply chains that support farmers to bring products to you that are from landscapes that are building soil carbon, which is the work of my organization, I'm watching things crumble as we're trying to rebuild. And it's been a very challenging couple of weeks watching small businesses and independent businesses suffering so much. At the same time, we're at this precipice of awareness building, which is shifting our consumer awareness towards that which we need to have on the landscape. It's just a moment of both watching things get worse as they're getting better. So I'll try to keep this brief, but I first just want to say to all of you that you are all investors and philanthropists. Whether you think of yourself as such or not, you are. Every time you take a penny, a dime, a dollar, you are literally part of a transformative experience investing in our regenerative agriculture future. Your most basic needs are met each day by agriculture. From the time you get out of bed, the bed sheets that kept you warm at night, you get out of the shower and dry yourself off, the towel that dries your skin, the clothing you put on, from your underwear to the layers you put on afterwards, are all coming from working lands. The food you eat for breakfast also comes from working lands, but you don't interface with the food until often you've done the other things. So what I'm bringing to your attention is that all of those pieces of your material culture are something that you've invested in financially. Very few of us are still producers of all our core material culture. Very few of us still produce all of our food and clothing ourselves in villages and homesteads. So we need to wake up to the modernity we really live in, which is technically we are called consumers, and I don't like the term. I've heard the term collaborator, but I'm going to reinvent this term. You are investors. You are philanthropists. And why I use the word philanthropist is because when you actually go out and pay the true cost of your food, or you go out and you look for that regeneratively farmed t-shirt, which is still very hard to find, you are literally, as a philanthropist, subsidizing the true cost and countering and buffering these farmers that are trying to do the right thing, buffering them against the false competition that has been created with subsidies that we are paying for with our tax dollars every year that have made clothing and food artificially cheap. So this idea that when you invest in something very connected to the land and you know the supply chain and you know the farmer and you pay $300 for a shirt, yes, $300 for a shirt, but you'll have it for 30 years, 40 years. Your grandchildren will inherit it. This is the kind of philanthropy I'm talking about in terms of consumption. You got to put your money into these items to sponsor and see this future move forward. It's not just public policy that's going to do this. In a Republican-controlled Congress, there is a lot of inaction. So the action is also going to come from us building this grassroots movement of a total shift in our material culture, which will come from how you invest in that which you wear and that which you eat. And there are examples on the landscape of this transformation taking place. There are opportunities to invest and donate with your purchases to move this along. And I'm also taking this time as we regenerate our soils and we look for those levers of change to make our working landscapes the bastions of carbon sequestration. I'm looking for opportunities to see right livelihood return and jobs and see the because we're not going to get much done when neoliberalism keeps creating more neo-fascism, and the dividing lines in this country are harsh right now. So the idea here is that we are going to regenerate community economies and the sheds model, a food shed, a fiber shed, your water shed, your fuel shed, your medicine shed. What is your material culture? Where does it come from? Becoming close to the biological context of that which you consume starts to bring the gap of exploitation down. You can't be sensitive and real and ignite change unless you know what you're igniting. And you have to be in proximity to that land-based, I believe, to really know what's happening. There's a lot that goes on when we aren't up close and personal with that working landscape. So our work is here in the Bay Area. We work with farmers and ranchers, makers and artisans to rebuild a soil-to-soil economy that will dress you and provide you what I see are heirloom clothing, where you create the Zen wardrobe. You end up with fewer items of clothing that you mend and re-dip in the indigo vats and you take care of for years to come. And you live a life of creativity and bliss because you're not worried about what you're wearing in the morning. You already know, it's your uniform. And this is ignited, this whole fiber system is ignited by the carbon cycle. It's not just about carbon sequestration, it's about harmonizing with the carbon moving through the 5 pools. And this idea is that you are capturing carbon with your clothing. You're capturing carbon with your food. The question is, how is it being captured? And I think that the ideas put forth within the food movement are pretty obvious. We're definitely eating carbohydrates and proteins, but we forget that we're wearing carbohydrates and proteins unless you're wearing a fossil fuel. And 70% of our wardrobes are becoming fossil fuel based. So to have us move towards a carbohydrate and protein-based closet is a key part of the transformation, let alone the regeneratively farmed closet, which is what we must move to, and the locally produced closet. Here's an example of one of our producer landscapes in West Marin. This is an integrated landscape. The other idea is that, farms, if we're going to reinvent agriculture, it's not just about the animals in one place and the cropland in the other. It's about how the animals move through the cropland. It's about how you're feeding and clothing. Again, all the material culture comes off of these integrated landscapes. These are the producers that we work with now. These are all the farms and ranches. You'll see that they're very close to where we're sitting today. These are the people who can dress you. Well, those little dots aren't, but there are faces behind the dots. And these are all the communities across the world that are starting to develop fibershed economies. This is place-based color. For those of us in the room, if you don't know where the dye came from your clothes, I can tell you now it came from a fossil carbon source. All synthetic dyes are fossil carbon. So if you want to divest from fossil fuels, it's time to start wearing clothing that's undyed or it's identified as naturally dyed from plant-based sources. We can do this with plants that are planted in hedgerows and windbreaks. We don't have to chew up too much arable land, really, for dye processes. Dyeing takes up the lion's share of the carbon footprint. Those spheres that say dyeing, that's how much dyeing is responsible for the CO2 footprint of a garment. It takes up 2 columns. And it's mainly because of the coal tar that's used and the heavy metal extraction that's used to create the colors. And most of our clothing we don't really understand, but more carbon is going into the atmosphere in weight than compared to the weight of the actual garment. And how many of you are wearing fiber that you know that it came from our community within 150 miles? John Wick, right on. Awesome. He and I have been working together a long time, so I'm slowly dressing him. And, excuse me, so what we know is that there's about 1.5 million pounds of protein fiber right here within 150 miles of where we're sitting, and none of us are wearing that protein. But a lot of us are wearing fossil fuel-derived substances and fleece that's, every time we wash it, turning into microplastic lint that's going out into our bay and throwing endocrine disruptors and mutagens out into our watersheds. We have an opportunity to use material that's not even valued. It's completely underutilized right now, right here. So we've mapped the fiber animals in California. These dots represent ranches. We have so much wool. We're the biggest wool producing state in the country. And you can make wool beautiful and soft as cotton if you so choose with enzymes. There are ways to make wool extremely wearable and next to the skin, non-toxic processes. I'll just go to this slide to promote what we're rebuilding as an organization. The clothing you wear should be compostable. It should come from regenerated soils that then return to that soil. I'll move ahead. That was the Marine Carbon Project science. I just want to show you the vision here is that we're drawing down through how we manage livestock and how we think about carbon. It's not a given that livestock are good for the soil, obviously. It's how you prescriptively manage them and integrate them with your other agricultural systems. We did an LCA at the biogeochemical lab at UC Berkeley with Dr. Marcia Delange to determine whether we could make clothing that represented a carbon sink using the Marine Carbon Project science. The green bar on the far left shows that we can actually make base layers from local farmed material from regenerated soils, and the key is the regenerated soil. This LCA depends on drawdown. When you incorporate biogeochemistry into your life cycle assessment, you can make clothing that literally represents a carbon sink instead of a net emission. We've been after materializing this LCA now for 3 years. We're building the supply chains. We're transforming rancher and farmer relationships. We're not building out new ranches and farms. We are actually working with some of the most conservative ranchers and farmers in the state who produce wool, and some of them are on BLM and national forest land, so I'd love to talk to Jared Huffman. We are seeing how we can use low-hanging fruit opportunities to transform the culture while building up supply chains. Again, giving existing working class people right livelihood is what we're up to manifest this idea of the net sink garment. And my time is up, so I just want to leave you with the last thing we're doing here that I want to have you support is the climate beneficial material culture economy. You're going to see a garment out by the North Face, and I think it's now the fall of 2017. They've moved it up. That'll be from a climate beneficial source, a local ranch in California. Patagonia is moving forward with us, and you're going to see a host of small designers and brands throughout this Bay Area bringing to you climate beneficial clothing from ranches and farms that have actual carbon farm plans. We've mapped how much CO2 we are sequestering, or I would say enhancing drawdown. We know how much of that carbon to appropriate to the proteins coming off that rancher farm, and we're mapping the entire supply chain to understand that net sink garment. And so these are starting to come out in prototype form, but literally we're generating it through real, live, solid businesses. Starting probably in the spring of this next year, you'll see the first what we call wool cloth CSA, and a host of Bay Area designers will be proliferating garments for you. So again, you are the philanthropist, you are the investor. I invite you to start transforming your wardrobes to carbohydrates and proteins. Start visiting the farms and ranches. Start getting to know the people that farm your clothes, and buy one garment a year from a farmer ranch that you have been to. You can do this, and I invite you to. Thank you.
That concludes the soil plenary. Now you know that there are many, many ways to rebuild soil and to be engaged in this movement. It's not only about gardening, it's also about getting dressed and feeding yourself and all your transactions. So without further ado, we're going to have the breakout sections now. We're a little behind, so lunch will be, instead of at 1:15, it'll be at 1:30.